All right. Good evening, everyone. So we will be starting with this webinar that today we are organizing on mobilizing green finance for industry transition. Uh, First of all, a warm welcome to all our panelists. Thank you all for agreeing to be a part of this very interesting discussion, what we hope will be an interesting discussion. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Ajay Mathur, who is the Director General of TERI. The panelists we have here today with us are Malika Sharma, who is the Chief of Corporate Sustainability at Tata Steel, Mr. Prabodh Acharya, who's Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSW Steel. These are our industry participants, and they are representing the industry viewpoints that we hope to dig into a bit more and understand from their perspective the kind of challenges they're facing with accessing green finance. From the finance side, we have with us Ms. Namita Vikas, who has a wide experience earlier working with the Yes Bank, and now she's the founder and manager. Telling us more about the new role and what she's doing there. We have with us Mr. Hari Gade, Hari from the World Bank. He's Senior Climate Change Specialist in Innovation, and he'll be telling us about the role that these kind of instruments can play in helping industry transitions to green. From the research side, we have with us Professor Carsten Newhoff, who's the head of the Department of Climate Policy at DIW Berlin. He's been working on understanding the EU perspective of industry transitions and the challenges that they have there and what's working. And we have with us Mr. Will Hall, who's Associate Fellow at TERI. Mr. Will has been working with us, working on a steel study, doing an intense one in the steel industry, which is something that TERI is working on in industry transition data. And I'll be getting a little bit more into it later on in my presentation. Next. Also to start with, just a few housekeeping comments. So all panelists, all attendees are welcome to please ask questions, but do it via the chat box. We won't be able to take questions directly from participants from the attendees here. The session is being also live streamed on YouTube and will be available later on also in case you'd like to go back to it. We will be sharing a summary of the event along with the link to these two reports that today's webinar is based out of. So that's just the context setting. And now I'll start with the presentation. Sorry, Sonali, next slide, please. To give you a little bit of background for what this webinar, where it's stemming from, for the past 1 year, we've been working under the International Climate Initiative funded where we've been looking at the challenges that the hard-to-abate sectors, for which we focused on the steel and cement industries of India, have in transitioning to low-carbon pathways. Specifically, our two key issues of deliberation that were the research questions for our report was, is there sufficient support in the form of finance instruments and policy frameworks to facilitate the green transition? And what are the gaps that international climate finance can fill and the role it can play to help transition these industries to a lower carbon pathways? So for this, we've gone through an extensive stakeholder engagement process. This was also done for the other report that's mentioned on the slide towards the low carbon steel sector, which was released in January during the WSTS at TERI. So in these studies, we've had a very extensive stakeholder engagement looking at the industry practitioners and also looking at talking to the government representatives, research and academia, and all organizations. So through this, we have kind of formed this report, and I will just quickly go over the key learnings from the report. Next slide, please. The report was published in July 2020. Paris. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So these are the barriers that we found. The underlying barrier that's actually leading to most of these issues is the policy and the regulatory framework, which is not sufficient to support and push the industries towards a greener transition. So that is the major underlying reason. And that's leading to three critical barriers. Lack of demand. The lack of demand stems from a lack of awareness and a lack of willingness to pay for green from the consumer side. During our engagement, we also spoke with some of the major users of the steel and cement products. We spoke with GMR Infrastructure, we spoke with Mahindra Life Sciences to understand their perspectives on this. And what they also were saying is that they are not, being the big corporates that they are and using so much of these materials, even they are not very well aware of the kind of green products that are there, what the technical specifications of these are, what the cost benefit analysis of using these are. So this is a big gap that exists, and there's a need which has been highlighted in our report, and we're also looking at some recommendations of how to address this. This links to its supply scale up, and that's the other major demand, major barrier category. This is largely due to the industries themselves are not getting enough policy support or regulatory push to go towards green. There's a lack of clarity on this form of lack of standards, the certification process, the green products that are there. There are no clear national pricing signals, carbon pricing signals at the national level. And all of this together is leading to a supply side barrier. And these two, the demand and supply, form a kind of vicious cycle, which is preventing the green transition to happen in a big way. And this is leading to also the other major barrier, which is the lack of enough financial resources. The financial institutes we spoke to, which included IFC, Jeff Capital, and some Indian banks, are not sure about the green, how to support the green, to channel green finance for them. Nature of the work is not considered to be what qualifies as green. So that acts as a big barrier, and to make the case, and also becomes a problem. Can we go to the next slide? Can we next slide, please? Thank you. So these are barriers. This just breaks it down to the interrelationship between the three types of barriers, which I already spoke about. So there's a limited awareness of green products. The regulation is insufficient to induce the demand, which is leading to a limited market for green products. So what happens is you green products at a large scale across the country, that is not possible. So even if an organization is looking for a green for procuring green products, not able to get the amount that they require or at the places that they require. What this leads to is high operation costs and high risk and upfront costs for the industry itself, but also for the it's also leading to high operation costs and high upfront risk and costs for the steel industry and the cement industry, which are not able to make this green transition due to technology barriers, which are at an unaffordable price right now. And there is a weak ecosystem which is there to support them in this, in the form of policy, regulations, or even finance resources, and the support required from the larger ecosystem through capacity to be able to transition. And this, like I mentioned, leading to the finance barriers of there being limited internal capacity at the financial institutions level, where they're not able to properly assess the costs and benefits of a green transition. The commercial viability of the technologies is not very clearly visible, and and they're limiting prerequisite standards because these industries do not qualify clearly as green. So there's a issue of how to kind of make the case of this green transition for the finance side also, for green finance specifically. Can you go to the next slide? Next slide, please. So the solution we have are in three large buckets that we've come up with, and these are the things just to start the process. There's a wide range of activities and initiatives that are required, but this is what we came across as being the ones that would be the most effective in kickstarting this process. I would also like to remark here that the recommendations that we formed are from a lot of industry engagement and has come from the industry themselves. It's what they have asked, what they highlighted as things that they would require. So we've tried to just collate it all together and put it in this report. The first requirement is of generating demand. This can be through regulations predominantly, and also incentivizing the use of green products. What this requires, like I said, there's a lack of awareness, lack of understanding of technical specifications of green products. A multi-industry engagement was suggested, where, say, the automobile industry can talk with the steel industry to understand their requirements and how the product matches up to their requirements. So that kind of interaction is not there right now, and it's a big need to kickstart this process. The second is public procurement. There is no proper system of having a green product there for the public procurement that the government does for its large infrastructure projects. That could be a very a key a critical way of actually starting this green demand and building the demand for these kind of products, which would also help in building larger supply and helping the industries to transition. So these are the two key things that need to be done to kickstart the demand generation part for green products for steel and cement industry. Moving to supply, there's to incentivize the supply, and that what was highlighted is there's a need for R&D support for novel technologies, because while the industries themselves are willing to try that out, they would require some kind of capacity, technical, financial, and also a larger support for the period, because the tenure of the period of these operating implementing these kind of technologies is longer, and for that time they would require some kind of a support. So a form for that, and there are some kind of systems that also exist in our regulatory in our policy framework, but it's not very well targeted towards the larger industries, especially the steel and cement. And the other thing was demonstration projects, so that the industries could try out the full implementation of a kind of technology up to its production. And that kind of a demonstration project is something that's been really asked for, especially for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization and storage projects. And that's one need for incentivizing. Solutions that came up are being aimed at lowering the cost of lending, basically at lowering the risk, perceived risk of such lending. And some forms that could be done through is blended finance, results-based finance, voluntary carbon markets, and transition bonds are two other categories, which is would be a good alternative form of channel for green finance for such industries. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to ask my colleague Will to please give an idea of the kind of next steps that we can take to go through this so far, and the recommendation we found through the work that Will's team is doing under the, TERI's industry transition work. Will, over to you now.
Thank you very much, Damiksha. So yeah, just taking through a few of those the broad headings which Damiksha talked through and talking them through in terms of specific examples of how these could be taken forward in India. So under the demand stimulation heading, we've already seen pretty active engagement in the establishment of green products, both under the steel heading, which is now being developed out of Europe, but has a global reach. And then also looking at India more specifically, the Green Pro standards, which are being developed by CII for India specifically, which are primarily looking at building material standards to maximize the environmental performance of those materials. And so what we need to see, going forward in the development of these standards is active engagement from industry in the kind of the stipulations of these standards to try and help create a market for premium and environmentally friendly products, which means that those more progressive companies, which are leading from the front in terms of deploying what will be ultimately more expensive low carbon technologies to deliver green products, can recover some of that cost through having their products certified under these standards. So I think it's really important going forward that Indian companies continue to engage in these standard developments. Next slide, please. Under the demonstration projects, which Damiksha mentioned, there's a real need to move ahead with very large and ambitious demonstration projects within the Indian context. We've seen a number of demonstration projects in the heavy industry segments cropping up across Europe and the US, and there are a couple of smaller scale projects already going ahead in India. But I think when you look at the scale of the challenge and the scale of industry demand growth over the coming decade, I think there's no reason why the demonstration projects being established in the 2020s can't be kind of large scale commercial scale projects, given that most of the technologies we're talking about, both in the cement and steel industries are largely technically well understood, but maybe not commercially well understood in terms of how to recover the finances for more expensive technology. One interesting example, just to talk through very quickly here, is a hydrogen-based steel plant where TERI's done a fair amount of work to understand the technical and economic barriers to deploying a large-scale steel plant in India. Looking at similar examples around the world, such as the hybrid plant based out of Sweden, you can imagine a commercial-scale hydrogen demonstration plant being set up in India would cost somewhere in the region of $1 to $2 billion. Taking into account the capital costs of the steel plant, as well as the hydrogen production equipment that would be needed to fuel that plant. So it's clearly a really, really significant investment and a very, very lumpy investment. But it's estimated that the steel from hydrogen direct reduction within the near term would cost around 20 to 30% more than steel from conventional sources. So it means over on the left-hand side where I have this chart, you could recover around 70 or 80% of that cost of the 1 to 2 billion just through the regular means of selling your steel at current market rates. But that remaining 30%, so for a large commercial scale plant, about £500 million or £500 million is where attention is needed to try and make up that gap, either through grant funding, which is difficult at that scale, potentially ongoing policy support such as carbon pricing, regulations or standards, or indeed some element of the green steel type premium product certification that I spoke about in the previous slide. So you can imagine in future years that green premium that I show on the bar chart on the left hand side could be met by a number of different policies and a number of different measures to try and ensure that the first commercial scale projects within India are established without a significant loss or a significant financial penalty to those progressive companies who are taking those first steps. But I think now we understand the scale of the problem and we understand the key technologies. I think there is a need to establish a kind of more dedicated consortia of steel companies, technology providers, financial institutions and government bodies to try and mobilize these sorts of projects, to try and move them from paper to reality, as we've seen in other parts of the world. And then moving on to the final slide, please. This third example here sits under the kind of the financing area, which Tamiksha spoke about. And this is about shifting the mindset and capacity within financial institutions around the world to move from financing largely just renewable projects to also financing industrial projects as well in the cement and steel sector. So you can see here as one example of one major fund, the Green Climate Fund, which funds projects in the developing world to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So under the Green Climate Fund, about 7 projects are focused in the areas of forestry and renewables. So clearly these have been areas of great importance over the past decade or so, and have deserved that kind of attention to help decarbonize the power sector and to help improve forestry cover in different countries. But I think as we're now seeing the renewables projects have become increasingly competitive, they can largely now start to be self-financing, where they're competing with coal-based generation or gas-based generation, even on an ongoing basis. So we should probably start to see funds such as the Green Climate Fund start to switch to sectors where finance is not readily available, such as for projects in the heavy industry segment. And I think if you look back, it's maybe taken, and through our conversations with different financial institutions, both public and private, we might see that it's taken maybe 10 or 15 years for financial institutions to really build the capacity internally so that they really understand different renewable projects and can invest in those with confidence, as they've been doing over the past 5 years or so. And so you might see a similar process being required for the heavy industry segments, where experts in industry specialists need to work with financial institutions to help these institutions realize what the potential projects would be in different parts of the world, the different technology options, and the scale of investment would be required, etc., to take that forward over the 2020s and 2030s. So those are three specific examples of how to take this forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Now we'll move on to our discussion. The discussion will be moderated and chaired by Dr. Mathur. Sir, I ask you to please give your opening remarks and start the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tamiksha. Also, warm welcome to all, both the panelists as well as to all our participants in the webinar today. I am delighted that we are discussing this issue. It's an important issue because we are looking at a future that has to be very different from yesterday. We are looking at a green future. And as Will mentioned, amongst many, many sectors, and steel is probably one of the most intractable of them, cement is probably even more intractable, it is very important that we start actions now. When I look at the steel sector and see that the amount of new capacity that will be put up in the next 15 years will probably be 3 times the capacity that exists today, we place at great risk this capacity if we use today's technologies of using coking coal to do reduction in the blast furnaces. However, the challenge remains that we have a technology which, though it is technologically proven, is yet to be commercially proven. And so green steel would be more costly than normal steel, black steel, or whatever we want to call it. This means that financing is both difficult as well as there is a good chance that people will not be able to repay it unless we have a market for green steel. Consequently, I think it is important that we study green financing today in view of the actions of tomorrow, right? Actions today, so that we can do things tomorrow and which lead to the greener future of 2050 or so on. The point I want to reiterate is that we cannot postpone this decision to a later date. I'm absolutely delighted that we have a group of panelists here who are drawn from the steel industry, the financing industry, the policy policy analysis industry, with a view to see what are the kinds of things that are needed, what are the kinds of analysis, what is the kind of next steps that need to be done. I'm absolutely delighted that Ms. Madhulika Sharma, who heads corporate responsibility at Tata Steel, is with us, as is Mr. Prabodh Acharya. Prabodh is the Chief Sustainability Officer of JSW Steel. Between them, Tata Steel and JSW Steel account for what? Something of the order of 60% of the steel production in India, and going ahead would account for much more. It's also a delight to welcome Namita Vikas. Namita has been a partner for a long time and is today the founder and managing partner of a new financing agency. We have Carsten Newhoff, who heads the Department of Climate Policy in DIW, and Hari Gadde from the World Bank, and Will Hall, my colleague who you heard just now. So what I'm going to do is ask each one of them to make a brief intervention. And by brief, I actually mean brief. I would like them to limit it to about 5 minutes or less. And following that, we will have a discussion. I do have questions for all of them. We'll also take questions from the panelists, and we hope to complete this by 5:15 India time, which is approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes from, no, it's 4:30. So sorry, it's 45 minutes from now. So there we don't have very much time. So without further ado, Madhulika, can we move to you?
Thanks, sir. Thanks. Thanks to TERI and for actually not only hosting this webinar, but also, coming out with this paper, which puts the, I'll say, the dilemma of the hard to abate sector, the two hard to abate sector, steel and cement, in black and white, and and I really like the framework which was used in the report, which is, the policy, and then, how the demand side and the supply side, how it's a vicious circle, and then what challenges it then throws for the financing of the transition. So as I think rightly mentioned, and it's been there in the report, and I think it was also alluded that India specific, and I'll cite some statistics from the IEA steel sector report, which was released last week, and some of and the report, the IEA report, has a special section only on Indian steel sector, because while they see in a long-term scenario, which is about 2050, they see that while steel production is going to dip in rest of the world, rest of the geographies, including China, which is which way the steel production is going to come down by about 25 to 30%. It's only in India as a large geography and a large economy, which the sector, the growth will be about between 4 to 5 times by 2050, and hence there is a special section only on steel sector. And but however, the IEA report is only saying about how does the roadmap look like and what are the possible technologies. I think to get there, what IEA is saying, or what is expected from our stakeholders in terms of transition to green economy, I think first of all, there has to be a demand. So that demand itself is not there. Will alluded to the Green Pro and the responsible steel. So, happy to announce that Tata Steel is the latest member of the Responsible Steel Initiative, which got initiated in Europe, but we are the first Asian member, kind of outside Europe, to become a member. And the other one is the homegrown, which is Green Pro. But I just wanted to mention that the largest in terms of, if I say weight, the commodity which gets used in the building or infrastructure is the rebar. And as per the Green Pro framework, there was till now there is no framework which will evaluate the Green Pro for a rebar. There's everything for glass, there's for tiles, everything is there. Cement is covered, but for rebars, somehow it was not there. So we are just partnering with CII Green Business Center to now. I think we have covered the stakeholder engagement part, and the feedback will be incorporated. And for Green Pro is going to come out for the first time since its inception. I think it must be 4 or 5 years for a first framework for a rebar, which is the biggest commodity which goes into the infrastructure creation. So I think the unless and until the market demand is there, there's no premium or there's no competition to actually produce, even if you have a commitment, because all of this is going to ask for money. And if you're not able to get a premium, I don't think we are in a free trade, and we also have our investors and shareholders to answer. So we cannot just keep on investing and see no return in terms of the differentiator that we are building. Even for the automotive sector, we do get, as a steel sector, we do get inquiries, and they ask a lot of big questionnaires in terms of what are your, KPIs, etc. However, the decision point is not based on this. It may be an exclusion point, but not a decision point that, you are good, so you will be given this order. So, because again, I think auto is a very, very competitive sector in itself. So I think with all of this, unless until there's no market, you cannot, the product has to serve a market need. So I think in India, I think, and happy that TERI is now come up, so that there is, and this awareness cannot be created by the sector alone. So you need a lot of people to come together, a lot of stakeholders to come together to actually create this need. Create this awareness about the green product part, and there's no framework, as I said. On the on the supply side, of course, the technologies. So, if India has to grow to that kind of steel, projections which are being made for India as a developing economy, I think there's a lot of capacity which is going to be put, and even if you take a ballpark figure, BF-BOF route, steel plant of 1 million ton will cost you about $1 billion. So which means that, and these are all lumpy investments. These investments are for 25 to 40 years, depends upon how you are doing, and this is happening now. So Tata Steel itself is putting a very big blast furnace at our Kalinganagar plant, which is going to add 5 million ton to our capacity, which is a blast furnace route. And this is going to be, at least see that it is going to stay till 2050. It will be there around 2050. And as you rightly mentioned, that the technologies are there, but not, the economics don't work out. Neither are the commercial scale, available, except for, I think, DRI route and the EF route, which is not really a new technology, but it is, but they do have challenges, because the DRI part, if you want natural gas, then in India, there's no natural gas. And even if you are importing natural gas, we don't have, steel sector doesn't have a priority, doesn't come in the priority list. So I think a multi-stakeholder, thing is required. It cannot be done by one industry or one, even if all the players in the industry come together, I don't think this great change will happen. We did see this change happening in the renewable space, but I think similar kind of thing is required for a similar transition to happen. And we would not, I think India should not miss the bus of becoming a green hub for green steel, so to say. And on the supply side, so yes, there are some weak signals that we have been picking as Tata Steel, but I think while renewable and the forestry, which Will said, that all of us know it, he only shared the data, but what if I think, why has this is not happening? So I get some queries from IFC if you have any projects, etc. So first of all, our projects are big size. And the second thing is, I don't think we have a set defined KPIs to actually, for renewable, the KPIs are very clear. After all, someone who is investing will also need some return. They are not going to give it to free. So these KPIs for, I think, hard to abate sectors, specifically for steel, what is it that you are going to measure? For example, if I want to do a pilot for a CCU, what is it that you are going to measure as an effectiveness at the end of whatever period that, climate fund comes? The second is, framework for that climate fund is not available. So there's an ISO standard being made, but I think, again, it's very, very European centric. And I think Mr. Prabodh Acharya can talk. We have been debating it in the World Steel that, if the growth has to happen in the India and the developing economies, the thresholds or the, that is being set means that only the good will become better or the better will become best. So I think these are some of the challenges. I think I will stop here and I'll let my other panelists speak, and will also await your questions and questions from the participants. Thank you. Thank you. I think you're on mute, sir.
There you are. Thanks so much, Madhulika. Thanks for pointing out that I was late. Can I immediately turn over to Prabodh? Madhulika spoke about the problems that they're having. Prabodh, I would very much like to hear from you how you look at this issue.
First of all, thank you very much for that question, Dr. Mathur. And I must appreciate the effort of TERI has taken in bringing out this report and having all this panel for today's discussion. So good afternoon, everybody. I think the barriers what we as an industry player are facing and the path forward are well articulated initially by Tamiksha in the summarizations of the report. And I think Madhulika has brought in those that we don't have a demand. I think she has brought in the demand side requirement. So let me tell a little differently to me that how and what we could do in the current circumstances, knowing fully well the barriers and the difficulties what as an industry we are facing, what else we could do to enhance the green financing or green transition in this hard to abate sector. So let me bring out 3-4 points here for the discussion. So what I see, as a responsible industry and steel industry all know, steel and cement industry all know, the growth of any nations depends on the growth of this industry also, because we support the infrastructure sector. And this is a difficulty in having deep decarbonization in these processes, that is also well known. So considering those circumstances, I propose 4 methods or 4 ways what if industry as an industry we can start looking at. The first thing is that as the industry, from a strategic perspective, can we institutionalize environmental cost into the pricing structure, which we are not doing? So currently there is no policy requirements, there is no demand from the customer. But what I am suggesting as a industry, can we do that? Because unless all corporations imbibe and reflect the true environmental cost in our decision-making process, then it would not make any significant impact in our ultimate objective of global emission reduction. And I think you have highlighted India being currently the second largest steel producer and possibly will be responsible for 1/5 of the world's steel by 2050. We need to look into this. To start with, if I can give an example, what we are doing in JSW, that we have started integrating internal carbon pricing to every capex decisions. Now, this is as a risk assessment tool we are trying to use and see that how the future decision of the investments are going to reflected by these pricing environmental aspects, and possibly we are starting with carbon. But then more and more as we do, possibly there will be a consensus among the investment decision-making bodies, industries, and the financiers to look at these issues, and possibly it will force some actions. I am hopeful. Second aspect, what I suggest as a corporate body, what we could do and we are doing, but looking at the growth of technical progress which is likely to happen in steel sector, it is very unlikely that any path-breaking technology are going to be practically implementable in next 20-30 years. So what we are left with? We are left with how can we integrate resource efficiency and material efficiency into our decision-making process and design the process, improve the efficiency to reduce the emissions. Second point is that how we can have circularity in our economy in mind, whatever we do. I think we have an excellent example of our cement business coming out. So, how do we, I know all steel industry focus on circularity, but then how mindfully we do that. And obviously, energy efficiency is one of the significant drivers at the present. And I think that, the PAT scheme is an important mechanism which is driving. The last point is that, we should focus on technological innovations, but how good or how well we are adopting the best available technology. And that is where we need to focus. As far I think Madhulika talked about the IEA report which has come last week, and that also predicts by material efficiency and performance improvement to the existing technology, that will be key for emission reduction in the short term, that is by 2030. Almost 95% cumulative emission reductions is going to be achieved through efficiency improvement. And that is where what we are doing in JSW, that we, with support from World Steel Association, we are doing a step-up process. And that step-up process has 4 levers to CO2 reduction. One is resource efficiency. That's how we can improve our raw material quality improvement and have the benchmark with the world operations. The second thing, energy efficiency, of course. Third is process reliability. And that process reliability has a lot of impact on the emission reductions. And last is process yield improvement. So all these aspects we are working. So again, the second point is that how well we use the current technology to its best possible and achievable standards. Third thing, I think Madhulika brought in this point, which is a very key point. How do we evaluate and how do we report the KPIs with respect to green transitions? And I would suggest that if we can, all industry bodies, including the authorities, can join force and create a digital platform, and that maintains an information flow of clear objective setting, monitoring, progress and impact evaluation across the country. Because if you look at now, almost 20% of the heavy industries doesn't have a structured reporting, monitoring and benchmarking system. That means most of the 1/5 of the industry do not know what is the best way to use current technology. So that is something we can possibly work, and that will help us in attracting more financing. The last but very important is the collaborations, because when we look at deep decarbonization in these sectors, it is obviously we need to, I mean, we can always work on what I stated in past 3 points for 10 or 20 years to have a impact on carbon reductions. But if you want to have really look at the complete net zero steel production or deep carbonizations, we need to bring in those technology which is in small scale getting proved to be, workable, I would say. So that is where we see that CCUS combined with current operations, hydrogen technologies or cogeneration and energy recovery technology, all this new technology requires not only demonstration but also requires a good collaboration with industry bodies outside of Indian economy, including Indian players, operations, industry bodies like us, researchers, and most important thing is that who is going to fund it. And just to give an example, even in JSW, we are looking at, we are talking with Brown University, Rise Institute, and Fronov Institute, CSR. We are working with them how we can make it feasible. But where again, if I go back to what is the difficulty we are facing, is how we bring in the required funding to demonstrate it. So these are the 4 points. I'll stop here and I'll go for discussion later. And these are my initially how we can contribute. Taking into consideration of all the known problems, limitations, and difficulties.
Pramod, this is very useful, very, very useful. I think this forward-looking approach of looking at markets becomes an effective way of looking at how we go. Namita, you have been involved in financing, I don't know, ever since I've known you, you've been a financier. How do you look at this problem? Namita?
Thank you very much, Ajay, and it's really a pleasure to be here with this group. Congratulations to TERI, as ever, to take a lead position in discussions that are very, very opportune and timely. So, if you look at the last 5 years and look at how the financial community has been acknowledging climate change and its associated systemic risks to long-term investments and credit portfolios. So this has brought scrutiny of several industrial sectors that are responsible for carbon intensive emissions that need to change, and particularly heavy industries and related pipeline infrastructure sectors. So, over years, green became the answer, and the financial sector started developing solutions that promote better production or utilization of resources, particularly in forms of green bonds. And it's become over a $250 billion market today across the world. And of course, there are variations that have come into play, which are, sustainable bonds or social development bonds or blue bonds, very recently, rhino bonds and loans for that matter. So participants across the financial spectrum and beyond have accepted these innovations, applauded issuers for the added financial or extra financial benefits on claims of dedicated use of proceeds, investors like asset managers or asset owners for the ease of accessing green labeled assets for thematic investing, policymakers and regulators for their own ability to bring in tags to retarget the capital flows to a more sustainable practice, and of course banks for finding the new underwriting opportunities, right? However, much of these transition efforts have focused on electricity, very rightly, as Madhulika pointed out, with renewable energy becoming mainstream, and the progress as far as high carbon sectors like steel, cement are concerned, these are very limited. So in these areas, transition initiatives are still very small scale, and new technologies, as Dr. Mathur, you mentioned, expensive, inefficient. So unfortunately, the sector has not been able to, break. This is the sector, these are the sectors that will make or break the adherence to the Paris Agreement, given their overall emitting abilities. And therefore, there is a kind of a reversing of the rising GHG levels and helping economies to adapt, high emitters will need to reimagine businesses, plan, implement transition pathways that have renewed priorities for GHG management and climate resilience, some of which, as Prabodha also mentioned. Now, the financial community too is seen to be opening up, and we've been having a lot of international sessions where a broader set of challenges that are related to climate change and the way sustainable finance is looking at solutions that are going beyond green. So here, I think it's very important for us to understand that sustainable finance is not just green or social finance, but it is more where it falls in the space of transition. And while the focus on climate change has seemed to be expanding to biodiversity challenges, inclusive growth, the financial circles are slowly acknowledging that for a fully decarbonized world by 2050, solely green processes like financing wind turbines, solar farms, electric vehicles, or green steel is not enough. A much larger number of sectors need to participate in this whole transition process. And I'm sorry, but sectors which are maybe called brown today and will remain brown for a long time. So that acknowledgement, I think it's very, very important. Unfortunately, as yet, the first point of consideration for the finance sector in financing, say, heavy industries, for example, is the risk return profile of the investment and not taking into consideration the impact or the transition. So while there has been a rise in the breadth of assets and activities that finance diversified cross section of global economy, so far there is limited traction where financial flows are not seen to be channelized towards large GHG emitters. So, in other words, the question remains as to how can we extend some of the benefits traditionally associated to green finance. So, green finance also moved to the compartment of traditional financing to these sectors. So, this could come in the form of reduced cost of funding, aided by, say, DFIs or financial institutions that look at particularly these areas. Access to larger pool of investors, communication very important to the financial community of a sustainability strategy, which Prabodha also mentioned as to how it is important to talk about this being a part of the strategy and not a kind of a sustainability segment of its own. The key challenges, though, lay in finding investments for green transitions of heavy industries, which is linked to, again, the lack of common understanding amongst institutional investors. So, we've seen that there is more and more uptake of ESG considerations in profiling borrowers. In case of heavy industries where ESG performance is bound to lag behind other industries, investors fail to understand the underlying potential of these investments. Thus, finding an all-green proposition for heavy industries, which is really lacking today, is much needed. And high carbon sectors often lose out on sustainable or green finance due to a lack of a clear product fit or very cautious investor sentiment. And therefore, this new breed of finance, if I may call it, as transition finance, targeted directly at hard to abate sectors has emerged to bridge the gap. And this is really presenting an opportunity for the markets to be able to aid a very sustainable transition. So, when we look at the larger challenge, transition and sustainable terms are differently used. Consequently, we've seen globally some investors have expressed concern about the lack of a set of robust industry adopted standards for transition instruments, financial instruments, and that tends to potentially get into the whole greenwashing area where the definition of being sustainable is bit green and not really linked to Paris aligned transition pathways. So what we're seeing is that there have been these green shoots of policy mechanisms or frameworks that are explaining what do you mean by transition finance. And this falls in a category where transition finance are not green today, but can become green tomorrow, can and need to get greener tomorrow with a pace which is fast enough to address the challenges or the roadmap to 2050 for that matter. So as a matter of fact, the international markets there are investments that are seen to declassify green finance and are being called transition finance. So they're really moving the narrative also from green to transition finance, and that's something that it's very important to look at. So, recently Climate Bonds Initiative of UK came up with a formal concept and is helping understand the idea of transition finance, where the label is clearly demarcating roles for both green and transition kind of finance that is coming into play. So, as markets expand, there is a need to encompass new sectors that need to rapidly decarbonize with a common, coherent, and scientifically credible framework for this transition, which is very much needed. What we've seen is that investors are supportive of a global definition of credible and ambitious transition, and that will cascade to India. Needless to say that such financing mechanisms need the support from policymakers. In case of India, climate change planning and financing, we've seen at a national level, but at an individual state level, remains very nascent. So while, PAT scheme has been a market-based mechanism to not only bring down consumptions, but also to incentivize industry through tradable certificates, I think more and more regulations, or at least a guideline, will help move the needle as far as the overall industry is concerned. So India undoubtedly needs to make the strides in the policy intervention direction, where we are able to include transition financing, especially for heavy industries, because I see that being a lot of opportunity. So, for JSW or for Tata Steel, issuing a transition bond will be far more easier than looking at green financing from mainstream institutions. So I will stop here, but I think there's a new set of emergence of finance that is coming in, and I'm glad that TERI has taken up this whole topic to be discussed, to be taken forward. Thank you.
Many thanks, Namita. And I specifically, while the big picture is there, I think the last suggestion on companies which have a strong balance sheet issuing these transition bonds is a new idea, and I think this is something which will need to be tested in the market. Karsten, Dr. Mohan, can we request you for your thoughts?
Thanks very much for the invitation and for comment a little bit from the distance on this question. At the same time, I think we are very close to India. Our two biggest steel companies in Europe are Tata Steel and ArcelorMittal. And so we very much watch to the developments in India for the guidance they have for what happens in Europe. I think also if I read the report from Tamiksha and her colleagues, I think now the discussions are not so dissimilar from what we have in Europe. I think there are some small changes that have evolved, and perhaps I comment on them to start. I think that triggered a lot of change, and that was very similar that as was just characterized by the finance sector started to get worried after they saw how much they had to write off coal power stations. They are struggling to kind of support major investments in coal-based steel making or other basic materials. And I think that really is one trigger point for the industry to say we have to find opportunities for investment and have to talk to policymakers to kind of create it. At the same time, this challenge the level of society, which really states in Europe that we want to be climate neutral by 2050, potentially even before this. And if you want to get a job, you want to be in a company associated with this. If you want to sell a consumer-based product, you want to have a vision how your materials get climate neutral to serve these objectives. It triggered a lot of change that went through the organizations and through the discourse. Now, what's the effect so far? We had 2 decades ago already the ultra-low carbon steelmaking initiative, which had promised by 2020 a big share of low carbon steelmaking implemented already, based on carbon capture and sequestration at the time primarily. It was ultimately after the Copenhagen Climate Agreement didn't really succeed in delivering a global emissions trading system, as I think the underlying vision was for many players that were hoping for this. I think that the changed with low cost availability of renewables. All that they also characterized for the Indian context are more hydrogen based or direct electricity based across sectors, which I think give a new opportunity also engage with the actors. At the same time, I think it becomes clear that in Europe, our energy constrained, I guess India is in a similar situation. So we're looking of finding ways of aligning the climate neutrality of production processes with getting better recycling, as you do as well, and making higher value materials to use less of these materials as we go forward. And I think it's interesting that I think drives significant changes in terms of how we think about policies, what they need to achieve. It's not only supporting the hydrogen-based steelmaking, but also supporting the recycling of materials, material efficiency along these lines as a whole package. I think it also gives opportunities, for example, in Europe, for member states that don't have a strong primary production process, because recycling is a more local activity. So you can actually strengthen the benefit across our European countries with such a more circular economy approach. And the recovery package, which was reached at the European scale, 750 billion euro, has also significant elements in terms of unlocking this. And I think the hope is that we can trigger quite a lot of investment. And I think the fascinating part for me is much of this investment very early already, within the next 5 years. If this is by industry, now there is public cash available. The cash might be scarce in 5 to 10 years. So actually a lot of companies we interviewed reported, okay, then we can accelerate these projects on primary production, on recycling, on sorting, if this is an opportunity to really make this transition happen and move forward. But I think like the TERI report outlined for India, we also see the strong need for a policy framework for many opportunities to go forward. The response often of policymakers is to support research and development and demonstration, but I think it's clear for companies that if they want to invest in this area, they need a business case to take on several plans as they go forward. And so the stronger ambition targets by 2030, climate neutrality after this, I think are an important part. And the question is, how is this reflected in the carbon pricing mechanism? So our ETS is not too dissimilar to the PET scheme in India. With free electrification, we give incentives for efficient production, but little cost increase passed on along the value chain. So not need to carry technologies at incremental costs, and little incentives for the circularity elements that I discussed earlier on, and that I think you also brought up. So that's the Europe discussion on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Is that making the entire value chain reflecting the carbon price? And I think it's important to discuss this globally to make sure that it is not a protectionist approach, but something that take forward projects in each region, and then that's how we most effectively cooperate across the regions going forward. As we also think green procurement is a strong element, and carbon contracts or differences to hedge the pricing risk associated with such mechanisms are elements as well. So, a pretty simple page, actually very closely linked through our companies, and hopefully can also very closely link the policy processes to achieve this transformation. We still have a lot of investment going forward. For us, it's more of transformation of existing assets.
Thank you very much, Carsten. I think the emphasis on the relationship with the policy process is important. And I think we need to discuss how this will come about. In February this year, we had brought out a brief which the steel minister had released, which looked at how we look at improvements during this decade, which were largely based on energy efficiency. You know, what Pramod was talking about as improvements to the current processes. My own belief is that that becomes the first step on which other actions then can be based. Let me now move to Hari Gadde. Hari, the floor is all yours. Hari is a senior climate change specialist who focuses on carbon markets and innovation at the World Bank.
Thanks, Dr. Ajay. Hope you can hear me. And also thanks to TERI for the invitation and also an opportunity to be part of this timely webinar. So I also join my fellow panelists actually congratulating TERI for producing this excellent report and of course a timely report. So I was asked basically to talk a little bit about the role carbon markets, especially the Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, could play to support these hard to abate sectors. In fact, of course, this is also a hard to answer question, because if you see that typically carbon markets under the Kyoto played a role where the revenue supported of filling the incremental cost gaps or improving the financial viability in some cases, of course, also to address some of the barriers, though the results are of course very mixed when it comes to the especially the hard to abate sectors. We have seen, of course, both in India's PAT scheme and also Professor Kristen mentioned, of course, also in ETS schemes like in EU, where these energy intensive industries are already part of the systems. However, I say that their effectiveness is limited in the sense that the flexible design options, especially to address competitiveness and leakage issues, has undermined some of the ultimate objectives or the goals that these schemes set up. And of course, as others actually pointed out, the mitigation options available for the so-called hard to abate sectors are limited and also very expensive. And because now, I think as Namita also mentioned, so in order for us to basically reach the target of the Paris Agreement and to allow the limit the global warming to below 2 degrees centigrade, that means like you need to find different ways actually how actually we can support these sectors. And as we know, how carbon markets under the Kyoto helped many sectors and projects in India, and of course, especially in the steel and cement sectors, the measures are mostly limited to waste heat recovery, fuel switch, and energy efficiency, that low cost energy efficiency. And of course, they are all with mixed results because of the additionality concerns, higher transaction costs, and because of the low volume of emission reductions. And we all know the story of the CDM right now, and of course, its current status, and of course, obviously, also the voluntary markets where not many projects from the industrial sector exist. With that background and also, of course, lessons we all learned in the last decade with Kyoto markets, I say that we all need to be a little bit cautiously optimistic about the potential for the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement when it comes to its role for the hard to abate sectors. And if you are following actually what all things happening in this space, so the recent assessment done by both World Bank and also International Emissions Trading Association, we found that Article 6 has a potential to reduce the total cost of implementing NDCs by more than half. It's almost like 250 billion per year by 2030, and alternately facilitates the removal of 50% more emissions, in the sense 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide in 2030 at no additional cost. Now, of course, the devil is in details. And now, even if you look at the India's NDC, it's not very clear actually that what kind of targets that they set when it comes to these hard to abate sector like steel, cement, other than of course mentioning, of course, obviously PAT scheme is one of the major pillars of the NDC, and this fly ash recovery, and then other zero defect and zero product kind of measures. But I think how we need to ensure that there is a policy clarity which aligns with, of course, the Paris goals, not just only the NDC, but also the other policies like the recent national resource efficiency policy, the steel risk, scrap recycling policies. All these kinds of policies that are applicable to hard to abate sectors are aligned with these goals. So from that point of view, I see there are three, at least, ways or opportunities for the sector to access carbon markets. So one is obviously, which is in debating for a while right now, and also I think TERI also has done a lot of work on this one. How do we actually expand the performance requirements under the current PAT scheme to cover CO2 emissions from, of course, energy intensity to CO2 emissions? I think, of course, obviously there are many issues that needs to be tackled, and especially when it comes to who claims what, and that means like their relationship with the NDC, and then of course PAT's own compliance goal, and also of course then the companies that are already having some kind of internal carbon pricing. And there the question of double counting and double climbing is very essential. And the second one, when on the PAT scheme, is of course if you wanted to make that change to cover CO2 emissions, then how actually you ensure the environmental integrity, and then how you align both the methodologies but also the compliance time periods of the scheme. There was also some debate on how actually we can make the fungibility between the PAT scheme and then of course the REC scheme to bring more market liquidity and then incentivize further to the private sector. So these are some of the critical questions that needs to be addressed. And then I think that is maybe the immediate step actually that India could think of actually to reduce emissions in these sectors. And the second one is obviously the accessing international carbon markets under Article 6, and also of course the huge debate that is ongoing with respect to the voluntary markets, how voluntary markets now coexist with the compliance markets when each country has their own NDC and they need to basically account for what is actually in all the markets. So this depends on how the final rules would look like. Of course, because the rules are still being finalized, and then we are hoping that Glasgow COP would give some clarity on how the Article 6 markets would look like. But I also say that that's a huge opportunity for countries like India, where we can basically think about how we interpret the different rules when it comes to the inside, outside out NDC, accounting requirements, mainly the so-called corresponding adjustments, and also at the domestic level, what the government's policy should be when it comes to the authorization requirements, because that's one of the very, very critical thing that needs to be discussed right now. So there are many ongoing pilots that World Bank, Switzerland, Sweden, and others are doing under this space. Of course, though we all recognize very well that this is not so easy to interpret what the future requirements, and then how do we actually operationalize at domestic level. So from my personal view, we need to go beyond project by project approach and towards mostly the sectoral and policy approaches. I think that's where the PAT scheme would fit very well into this new kind of approaches that are needed, because project by project approach is useful, but it's not going to help actually to achieve the scale that is what we needed. Measures like waste heat recovery and then common low cost energy efficiency measures might face difficulties basically to qualify under Article 6 of the PA. We need to move away from the traditional additionality assessments, need to standardize regulatory requirements. Most importantly, we need to have a clarity at the domestic level with what kind of Article 6 policy framework that defines how India wants to incentivize the private sector to participate in those markets. So given the interlinkage with NDC targets, and most importantly, a requirement for each sector to align with 2 degrees target, hard to abate sector need a package of solutions. I think that's where I see this carbon pricing and carbon finance is one of the solutions, but not the only solution that is useful in the context of hard to abate sectors. I think internal carbon pricing, like the proposed mentioned, so is in the right direction. I think many Indian companies are already started thinking on that one as part, and they're also part of the carbon pricing leadership coalition, where there's a huge discussion happening, and that how do actually companies can introduce more such kind of carbon pricing that aligns with the science-based targets or the Paris alignment. I think the solutions that are needed, especially for example, to meet the 2 degrees centigrade. I think as others mentioned, there are very expensive, and they are not available another 10 or 15 years. So how actually that we need to start with what is that is already available. So that means we need to have some kind of a tipping points where heavy industrial emissions can start bending. In that context, so how actually all the policies need to be aligned, and how basically these transformations need to be supported by a climate policy based on the new SDGs. And I also even argue that to look into how the industrial policy in India needs to be made green, and then what are some of the things that needs to be incorporated in that, so as to take the opportunity of all the tools and then resources that are existing outside. So I will stop it here, and then happy to answer any further questions, especially on the carbon markets during this session. Thanks.
Thank you. Will, would you like to add anything?
I can add a very brief couple of minutes before we finish. So, yeah, as Dr. Mathur mentioned, earlier this year, we had produced a detailed kind of technical report which provides some of the technical underpinnings to the work that TERI has published in our recent report. Some feedback coming from you. Is there some feedback? Put yourself on mute.
You periodically go on mute and then you come back. So your voice comes and goes.
Okay. Could you put your
This is good.
Okay. So our analysis from the steel report suggested that even as material efficiency and energy efficiency is very important, if you look and if you maximize those two measures, realistically, that can only achieve a kind of a maximum of 40% emissions reduction. So what you find is that to get to very low levels of emissions, you really need to start investing in deep decarbonisation technologies over the 2020s and 2030s to hit decarbonisation targets in the second half of the century for India. And I think some of the analysis that we produced in that report, our conclusion was that today in 2020, the Indian steel sector is stuck between a rock and a hard place, with the rock being decarbonisation and the hard place being the competitive pressures that the steel sector faces, being an internationally traded product. And I think those pressures have only got worse on the competitive side with COVID, obviously increasing the downturn that you've seen in the steel sector. There's a growing glut of production capacity in China, which is also placing downward pressure on prices, which again makes it harder for the steel sector in India to transition. And there's also a growing difficulty to keep abreast with the speed of latest technology developments that are being developed by industry leaders. And I think, unlike other parts of the world, India doesn't have the kind of supportive policy framework to help them negotiate those two motivations, both the decarbonisation and the competition. So, for example, in the EU, which Carsten spoke about, there's obviously the carbon border adjustment as well as the EU ETS, which provides the incentive in terms of the carbon price, but then also the protection in terms of the carbon border adjustment. I think whenever India talks about placing a penalty on emissions, which I think is a good way to go, there should also be that conversation about, okay, alongside that penalty, what kind of protection can we also leverage? But I think it's also worth thinking about beyond these punitive measures. Again, as Mr. Acharya said, what are the kind of collaborative measures that we can take going forward? Because I think you will need both punitive measures and collaborative measures to advance this sufficiently fast. And I think it's worth for the Indian steel sector to increase their engagement in such forums as the Clean Energy Ministerial through the Government of India, which helps to drive forward global policy best practice. And they've started looking at heavy industry in a bigger way. Through mission innovation, how India can attract innovation projects for the steel sector. Also under the UNFCCC, the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, which also is helping to drive forward steel sector decarbonisation. And then in the private sector sphere, the Mission Possible platform, which was and the Energy Transition Commission. And I think all of these collaborative forums can help accelerate the transition that's otherwise taking place. I think the last point to finish on is just how we might see in the coming years how we've seen in the past, say, 2 or 3 years, a global focus on the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is focused on removing coal from the power sector. So if you look at the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which was only established 3 years ago, it's achieved a huge amount in terms of pressuring financiers and countries from committing to no longer financing new coal-fired power generation. I think the steel sector, both in India and globally, should prepare themselves for a world in the not too distant future where they could move from powering past coal to powering past blast furnaces. And I think, at the rate of change and political pressure that we've seen in the past few years, that's a very real world in the 2020s, which steel sectors should be preparing themselves for and understand how they can leverage that pressure to their benefit. I think in India, you can leverage that pressure to try and receive additional support both on technology and finance from areas like the Green Climate Fund. I think that's both a challenge and an opportunity for the sector to take advantage of in the 2020s. But I'll finish there. Thank you, Dr. Martha.
Thanks, Will. We have about 10 minutes more. So instead of a specific question, as I thought, which I would draw on your expertise, my colleagues have put together all the questions that we have received and all the comments that you have made and converted them into 4 questions. So I'm going to put these 4 questions before you and ask each one of you for a 1-minute response to any one of them, or 2 of them, or 3 of them, or 4 of them. But I would request you to limit your comments to 1.5 minutes. So the questions that I have is, you spoke about the challenges. So what is the key first step? If a green transition is involved, what is the key first step? That's the first question. The second is, I think the point was made that the financial needs here are different from what happened in the renewable energy transition. And if that is the case, and if we want finance for sustainable industry, then how do we reach the scale that the finance for renewables has attained, right? So if this is different, how do we reach the scale that is needed? The third is a specific question to our steel makers at Tata Steel and JSW. Does hydrogen form a part of your decarbonization strategy? And the fourth, and this is, I believe, a tough one. If you're looking at the impact of green finance, how would you measure that impact? So supposing we're able to be successful and do green finance, what would be the kind of impact parameters that we would use? So I'm putting these 4 questions. I'll repeat them once more. What are the key first step involved in the green transition? First question. Second, how do we reach the kind of a scale in financing, especially if that financing is going to be different from the way we have financed renewables? Third, does hydrogen form a part of the decarbonization strategy at Tata Steel and JSW? And fourth, what are the impact parameters for green finance? So let me turn again to our panelists and request them for short answers to either one or more of the questions. Madhulika, all yours.
So thanks, Dr. Mathur. I think I'll take question 1 and the question 3, which is specific to steel sector. So on the challenge part, I think the framework which TERI has used in the report, I think that the underpinning thing is policy and regulatory thing. So to drive the demand side and supply side, and then to make the finances available, I think there needs to be a very strong messaging or very strong thing from the regulatory part. Now what it could be, I think it was alluded that it is not one single thing that will be the answer. It will be a whole lot of suite of things, but I think that's where it needs to start. I think that what is the role of these sectors? So India's NDC is very heavily tended towards our renewable energy. So how does these 2 key sectors feature in India's NDC, or what is the role of these 2 sectors in the NDC? I think the clarity is not there. So maybe that could be the starting point. And of course, what does the sector need in terms of actually doing the transition? Then I think this clarity will be there in all these set of stakeholders, whether it is the producers or the lenders or consumers, all of them. So I think very briefly, this could be the starting point. On hydrogen, of course, hydrogen, I think it's there are 2 big near zero technologies which any steel sector is looking at. Hydrogen because we use carbon not as a fuel, we use it as a reductant. So I think the alternate to carbon as a reductant as per chemistry is another good thing, could be hydrogen. But of course, production of hydrogen and the whole supply chain of hydrogen, I think that's a larger question. There could be another debate on that. So I think I could be as brief as this. So
Thanks, Madhulika. I will leave you with a thought. The Paris Agreement is a global commitment. It was made at a time when we were kind of sure that it is possible for us to control technology and finance, though we were not yet either at the scale or the prices that we needed. Now, in the case of steel, we are not even there. So I'll just leave this thought with you. Should this be an international commitment, or should we start with domestic goals? Just leave it there. Prabodh, all yours.
Thank you very much. To answer your first question, I think one word is the collaboration. To answer your third question, hydrogen is a key strategy for us in JSW and will remain. The reason I think Madhulika told that carbon we are using, coke we are using for reduction. The only possible reduction material is the hydrogen. We are also looking at hydrogen used in the short term and also in the long term. See, the important thing is we have to understand that in the short term also we can use in the DRI, also we can inject in the blast furnace to reduce the coke rate, and therefore we can reduce the emissions. And important question here is that how we can, and production of hydrogen is not something which is unknown. People know how to produce hydrogen. Question is that how we can produce commercially viable green hydrogen sufficiently available for the using steel industry. So that's the question. And to answer your last question, which is of course difficult, but I'll start with that it must start with a specific time framed targets to measure the impact. That's my short answer.
Good point. Very good point, Prabodh. I think this issue of time becomes essential to us. Let me jump to Namita. Namita, all yours.
So I think, Ajay, very important questions here. And if we draw a similarity from what happened to the renewable energy sector, the uptake of finance towards renewable energy issuance of green bonds in India was on the back of certain incentives that the RBI offered to the infrastructure sector financing that banks were doing, right? And we saw uptake on that. So I think, some kind of policies or regulations that will help finance get channelized to steel and cement will be very important. My first point. Second is, I think understanding the risks are very important. At the end of the day, investors, financiers will look at risk and returns, and therefore decoding those risks and also demystifying those risks would be important. The opportunities need to be broken down sectorally. So cement treated separately from steel, and therefore how do we look at what are the kind of opportunities that lie there? So granularity is very, very important. My third point is good articulation of every role that each faction plays. What is the role of the government? What is the role of the corporations? Yeah. And my final point is, we just heard about the Ministry of Finance looking at a developmental financial institution for infrastructure financing, right? I mean, I think that is the big opportunity to bring in transition finance and focus on how that finance can flow through the pipeline of infrastructure allied sectors like steel and cement. I think that will be the. Thank you.
Great, Namita. I mean, this is wonderful. It takes the discussion first, tells us of the new areas we need to get in, the issue both of transition finance, of infrastructure development finance, and of roads. Thanks very much. Karsten?
No. I think the most important first step is this kind of debate. I feel that I'm really fascinated to see this debate and the constructive engagement. And I think that comes back to your question about global collaboration. It's all about national ownership of the strategy and the moves forward. And I think the second part is therefore, what are the incentives and the motivations for players at the industry level to participate? For me, the sense in the European experience was we are making a lot of progress now that industry also wants to move to climate neutrality. Because then it's a complex sector, it's a lot of things. And I think that getting that interest and keeping that on the board is very helpful. And I think the finance sector is really helpful in putting a lot of pressure on this at the moment, stranded asset risks. But I think it will be positive also, and we are starting to work on frameworks for this, such as companies that have low transition risks, companies that have a long-term sustainable business model get better access to finance because they are not such a risky investment. I think that's an important next step in this area. We also will see what we already see in the national context at a global scale, that consumers say we want a climate neutral product. And I see sometime in the future, countries will say, I don't know which first, we want to have only climate neutral products sold in our countries. And I think that is a long-term risk for any manufacturing industry, and any manufacturing industry will ask the basic material producers to provide climate neutral products for this. And I think that is global interaction along these lines again. And I think that comes to the final point. I think we need to help each other in achieving the objectives. Other linkages and cooperation is important, but also I think we have a commitment of 100 billion climate finance. And I like the comments very much from Mr. Howell, in terms of how we can further develop Article 6 towards supporting policies rather than specific projects in the global context.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karsten. I think the issue of international cooperation in this particular area is important because all of us are at the same point, whether it's developed or developing countries. And I think whether it is in terms of technology or in terms of policy or in terms of finance, understanding what is happening and therefore learning from each other becomes important. Thanks very much, sir. Hari?
I think, yeah, excellent points made by all others. But I think I will add one more thing to the suite of proposals that that's made, is that to have a internal carbon pricing. I think that is very, very, important step that companies can do without any intervention from the government side. So having an internal carbon pricing and aligning that with the science-based targets is basically is I think a first step, in my view, actually, that can be done to accelerate the the dialogue, and also of course to access more green finance. And also of course, in line with what Karsten mentioned, I think the $100 billion through green finance, green climate fund, and then as I think one of the slides that Hill shown, actually, that there are very limited allocation of that kind of finance to the steel and hard to abate sectors. I think that's how do we actually make GCF, especially the private sector window of the GCF, can be made effective, basically to offer more such kind of climate finance to these sectors is one thing actually I think that we are need to work. I think that's where maybe the collaboration and also the having the clarity on from the industry side is very important. So I will add these two points: internal carbon pricing, and then how do we actually increase the effectiveness of GCF to support these sectors.
I wish we had more time, Hari. I would like you to take you up on this, but I'll leave this thought with you. So you see the Tata Steels and the JSWs and the Mahindras starting to put in internal carbon pricing. That's happening. We want everybody to do it. Should it be part then of the stress tests that the RBI asks financial institutions and therefore their borrowers to do? I'll leave it to you, because we do need to find a way in which we internalize this issue of at least companies looking at what happens if they get this sudden shock of climate goal. Finally, Will, any final points?
Nothing much more in from my side, but just say I think to scale it up, we certainly need to now move from thinking about individual projects that we've been talking about to really talking about broad scale policy frameworks to shift into and not just single projects. But I'll leave it there. I'll keep it short given the time. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Will. I am also very conscious of the fact that we are over our time budget. I had initially thought that with webinars, you can't really cross time, but yes, you can get into interesting discussions like today and forget all idea of time. But I want to thank each one of you, the panelists, for the excellent discussions we had. As has been noted, this group coming together has enabled ideas to be put on the table, has enabled cross-pollination, which had not happened earlier. We are delighted to have you all here. We're delighted at this move towards helping us all come up with the kinds of next level of questions that we need to address. To all the participants, many, many thanks for joining us. I hope that you saw your questions in the questions that we put to the panelists. And I do hope to welcome you all to another webinar as we move ahead on this subject. So with that, many thanks and Godspeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye all.